America enjoyed a great deal of prosperity in the 1920s. However, in the next decade of the 1930s, we have the Great Depression. The Great Depression, which began in 1929 and lasted until 1940, was a period of time where the economy plummeted or went down and unemployment skyrocketed. The beginning is signaled usually by the stock market crash of 1929, in which all stocks had lost their value. This was because a great deal of people were using buying on margin as a way to get into the stock market. Also, banks and businesses began to fail during the Great Depression. After the stock market crashed, people started to panic and withdrew all their money from their banks. However, when they went to the banks, people were not able to get their money because the banks had already invested it or already loaned it out and did not get the payments back. So here are the causes of the Great Depression. First, tariffs or import taxes and war debt policies cut down our foreign market for American goods. Because we were not willing to help out the other countries around the world with their products, they were not willing to sell ours as well. Also, the farmers of America had developed a crisis of their own. They were growing way too many farm goods and were not able to sell it. Also, it became too easy for people to get credit. Think about all those installment plans that we discussed in the consumer economy worksheet. Anyone could have a credit plan or buy on margin, and they were very easy to build up debt. Another cause is an unequal distribution of income. So you had very rich people and very poor people as well. All these factors led to falling demand for consumer goods, and the federal government kept the interest rates of loans low. This made it easy for people and companies to build large debts. The Great Depression was just not an isolated event in America, it also had global effects. The US was not the only country being affected. Countries in Europe, such as Germany and England, also felt terrible effects of a depression. European countries continued to suffer in the 1930s as they did in the 1920s, such as Germany. This makes it easy for Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party to take power in Germany at that time. In America, whenever there seems to be a crisis, the people usually turn to the president for help. Herbert Hoover, who was elected in 1929, tried to help the Great Depression by passing the Hawley-Smoot Tariff. He did this in hope of stimulating the domestic economy, or our economy here in America. This tariff did the following. First, it established the highest protective tariff in United States history and was designed to protect American farmers and manufacturers from foreign competition. The way it did this was by lowering American-made goods prices and raising the prices of foreign-made goods. However, this was ineffective because one, it prevented other countries from earning American currency to buy American goods, and two, it made unemployment worse in industries that could no longer export goods to Europe. During the Great Depression, in the cities, people started to lose their jobs and were therefore evicted from their homes and became homeless. Many of these people decided to build shanty towns or little towns consisting of shacks. People became desperate for food and began picking through the garbage to look for scraps. To stop this from happening, soup kitchens offered free or low-cost food. Here is an example of a shanty town. As you can see, shanty towns were constructed by whatever people could find for shelter. Here is an example of what is called a bread line, where people would wait almost all day for handouts of bread so that they would not starve. The lines for soup kitchens also resembled this. Minorities were also affected by the Great Depression. African Americans and Latinos had a very difficult time coping with the effects of the Depression. They got paid significantly less to begin with, they had higher unemployment rates, and they had to deal with increasing violence from unemployed whites competing for the same jobs that they held. It was at this time that whites demanded that Latinos start being deported. By the late 1930s, hundreds of thousands of people of Mexican descent relocated to Mexico. They had originally come for economic opportunity. Life in the countryside or rural areas also changed at this time. The only advantage to living in a rural area was that you could grow your own food. Many farmers started to lose their land, and many went into foreclosure because their farms could not pay their debts. Many farmers turned to tenant farming or rent farming to make a living. Another issue the farmers faced during the Great Depression was a period of time known as the Dust Bowl. This was the biggest drought in American history that started in the 1930s. The drought happened because farmers were constantly plowing and planting the same area of land over and over again. Because of this, grass did not grow, and when the drought began, there was little to hold the dirt down when the wind blew, which caused dirt to blow for miles. The region that was hardest hit was parts of Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, New Mexico, and Colorado. Dust storms and evictions also caused many farmers to leave their land behind. By the end of the 1930s, hundreds of thousands of farm families had migrated to California or other Pacific Coast states. Here you will see a diagram of where the Dust Bowl occurred. As you can see, it is the brown mark on the map. Here's an example of what a dust storm would have looked like in the Great Plains. Here's another example of the effects of the Dust Bowl on farming families. The Great Depression greatly affected American families. Many men resorted to walking the streets to try to find jobs. Many men also left their families because they were embarrassed for the fact that they could not provide for their children and wives. This led to the creation of hobos, or people who wandered the country riding in railroad boxcars and sleeping under bridges. During the early years of the Depression, there was no federal system of direct relief, or cash payments or food provided by the government to the poor like we have today. This is known as welfare. Children also suffered during the Great Depression of poor diets and health care. Because of falling tax money being collected, this caused school boards to shorten the school year or shut down schools altogether. This meant more children were working in sweatshops just like during the Progressive Era. Many teenagers started hopping on trains and leaving home to travel the country looking for work. These kids were known as wild boys. They were usually sons of poor farmers or men out of work like miners or wealthy parents who had lost everything. These teens were often beaten or jailed and often killed. The Great Depression didn't just hurt American people economically, it hurt them socially and psychologically. People often lost their will to survive and committed suicide because of their great losses. Adults stopped going to the doctor and dentist because they couldn't afford to go to keep their health going. Less people started going to college. People put off getting married and having children. Achieving financial stability became the most important thing to people. People gave to the needy more often. And habits of saving shaped this generation. They were no longer going to put their money down for cars like they did previously in the 1920s. Again, Americans turned to Herbert Hoover for help in this crisis. But his philosophy prevented the government from giving any real help. He thought that Americans depended on rugged individualism, or people succeeding through their own efforts. Because of this, Hoover opposed all federal welfare programs. The response of America was that they were very shocked that the president himself would not help them through this problem. So Hoover took a cautious approach due to his philosophy. He asked employers to not cut wages or lay off workers even though they weren't making any money. He also asked labor leaders or union leaders to not ask for higher wages. None of these steps made a big difference, and the economy was still shrinking and unemployment still rose. Because it was clear that the president was not going to step up in this crisis, Americans began to get frustrated. Because of America's frustration with Hoover and the Republicans, the Democrats started to win more seats in the congressional elections. Farmers also had to start burning a lot of their crops and dumping their milk because they would not be making any money from it. People began calling shanty towns, or those towns made of shacks, Hoovervilles to make fun of Hoover. Homeless people also wrapped themselves in Hoover blankets. This was really just a piece of newspaper. When Hoover saw the amount of frustration towards him, he decided to take some kind of action. First, he created the Federal Farm Board. The purpose was to raise crop prices by helping members of the board to buy crops and keep them off the market until prices rose. In 1932, he created the Federal Home Loan Bank Act, which lowered mortgage rates or loan rates for homeowners and allowed farmers to refinance their farm loans to avoid foreclosure. This made their payments smaller. He also created the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. This authorized up to $2 billion for emergency financing for banks, life insurance companies, railroads, and large businesses. Please note that no small businesses would be helped by any of this. One of the biggest blows to Hoover's popularity was how he dealt with the Bonus Army. The Bonus Army was made up of a bunch of World War I veterans that decided to march on Washington. They were angry that the government did not pay a bonus to their vets who weren't paid enough during their wartime service. The Senate then voted down the Patman bill, which would have given this money, and Hoover forced the Bonus Army to leave. When some of the army did not leave, Hoover decided that they must be disbanded, and on July 28, 1932, he ordered General Douglas MacArthur and Major Dwight D. Eisenhower to get rid of the veterans. They did this by gassing more than 1,000 people. 2 people were shot and many were injured, including children. With the election of 1932 coming up, Hoover had to face a new candidate, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. FDR saw the gassing of the bonus army as a sure way for him to win the election. The downturn of the economy and Hoover's inability to deal effectively with the Depression showed that he would not be reelected. In the election of 1932, the only states to vote for Hoover were Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. Every other state in America had voted for FDR, the Democrat. It was clear that America was fed up with Hoover and needed someone to offer them a new deal.